Venice is a maze, is a city that speaks to the heart and that makes your inner self vibrate. Come on and let you go. Follow me through the maze. Today's episode starts from the water bus stop named Celestia, positioned on the northern side of Venice. Part of our itinerary still moves around the walls of the arsenal. This was the area of the homes of the family Sagredo, a family that extinguished in 1871. They were from Rome, then they lived in Dalmatia, and they moved to Venice in 840, one of the oldest Venetian families. We are now in Calle del Cimitero, the street of the cemetery. The Calle took its name from the burial ground of the church of San Francesco della Vigna. This graveyard was closed by Napoleon in 1807, along with all the other local burial grounds in Venice, with the deceased being then reinterred on the Isola di San Michele. On the front of this building, a plaque that reminds us that the building was hit by a bomb during the First World War. At the end of the Calle, we turn left and then right to enter Campo della Confraternita. On the corner, a building that housed the Brotherhood of the Sacred Stigmata, and today still visible on the walls, the coats of arms of the fraternity. Campo della Confraternita is bounded on its north side by the Church of San Francesco della Vigna. Over the side entrance to the church, there is a relief of the Virgin and the Angel of the Annunciation, a 16th century work attributed to Guglielmo Bergamasco. On the south side of the Campo, the former Convento delle Pizzocchere. This was founded in 1471 as a convent school for poor girls, which was closed by the French in 1810. In 1838, it was purchased by the Franciscans, who joined it by an arcade to the building at the far end of the Campo, the Palazzo Annunziatoro, where they were then living. This palace was built in 1525 for Doge Andrea Gritti. It was purchased by the Republic and presented to Pope Pius IV in 1564 as a residence for the Apostolic Nuncio. Then, in 1836, it was acquired by the Franciscans, who lived there and in the adjacent Convento delle Pizzocchere until 1866, when both buildings were taken over by the Italian government for use as a military tribunal. The church and its monastery was founded by the Franciscans in 1253. The land on which the church was built had been a vigna or vineyard, and so it came to be called San Francesco della Vigna. The church, in its present form, dates from a rebuilding in 1534 by Jacopo Sansovino, and then modified by Francesco Zorzi to keep the space an harmonic proportion according to the principles of the Camera in music. It then later received a classical facade designed by Andrea Palladio. The church is also the place where Mark, our patron saint, landed during a storm, coming from Aquileia on the way to Rome. And this is where he received the famous dream that predicted him an eternal rest in Venice. The monastery of San Francesco della Vigna houses a library that already in the 16th century had a remarkable reputation. Owns about 30,000 religious texts, including choral manuscripts and ancient texts. And now let's move on to Fundamenta Santa Giustina, the site of the church and the convent of Augustinian nuns. The church dates back to the 7th century, one of the oldest of Venice, and it was rebuilt in the 1500s and had a new facade made by Longhena in 1640. During the Napoleonic regime, the church lost the upper decoration, the bell tower, and was divided into two different floors. The church and the adjacent convent then became important because of a coincidence of dates. St. Justin's feast day, the 7th of October, happened to coincide with Venice's victory over the Ottoman Empire in the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. And then from that moment on, the Doge would take every year a special trip to attend a Thanksgiving Mass. And during the service, they were singing the Te Deum song. And the street right behind the church has the name of the song. Today, the church and the convent are housing a school, a high school. And right under the name of the street, I happened to find an open door and managed to spy inside and finding an amazing little Venetian courtyard that I never saw before. Next to the bridge, a little shrine that shows the Virgin Mary, and underneath a bas-relief with two little gondolas to recall the gondola ferry boat that was standing over here. Now we cross the bridge del Fontego and then we take the calle with the same name. The word derives from a deposit of flour that was at the foot of the bridge. And then we enter Salizzada Santa Giustina. Salizzada is a term that was given to define the first streets that were paved in town. On the left-hand side, we are finding Palazzo Contarini del Ferro. The name comes from the door that in the past was covered with iron studs, then removed in 1839. Quite beautiful is also the statue of the Virgin Mary that decorates the corner of the wall that belonged to the garden of the palace. The Salizzada continues into Calle del Morion. Morion was a helmet, and along the street in the past there was a famous pharmacy that worked till the 1700s. On the left-hand side, also beautiful little courtyards opening with a picturesque aspect. Now we retrace our steps and we return into Salizzada Santa Giustina, and we're finding on the left-hand side Calle dei Bombardieri, the street of the Bombardiers. This named for the Confraternita dei Bombardieri, founded in 1500 by artillerymen in the Venetian army, with its scuola at the Church of Santa Maria Formosa. The confraternity owned 6 small houses on the Calle, which are still identifiable by the numbers 1 to 6, 3 of them bearing figures of Santa Barbara, patron saint of the gunners. A few meters ahead, on the left-hand side, we finding Corte Nova, that also served as a votive chapel. At the entrance, an inscription that reminds us of miraculous events that happen on the spot. When terrible waves of the Black Plague spread throughout the city around 1630, only the residents of Corte Nova were protected due to a sacred image of the Virgin painted by a resident of the court, remembered by the name Giovanna. In the late 17th century, or possibly the early 18th, the sottoportico was decorated with wood paneling and a painted and gilded coffered ceiling. 4 votive paintings illustrating Venice struggling to overcome the plague through divine intervention and medical assistance were added. Unfortunately, Giovanna's original painting is now lost, and residents of the Corte have placed a modern copy. A red slab of marble marks the point in the pavement near the center of the underpass where the legend says that the plague was stopped from entering the Corte in front of the miraculous painting of the Virgin. Even to this day, the red stone holds a special meaning for Venetians who would not step on it for fear of bad luck. Now we head to the bridge that crosses Rio di San Lorenzo. We walk along the fondamenta and then again we cross Ponte della Commenda. And we're finding ourselves in front of the Scuola di San Giorgio degli Schiavoni that we're going to talk about in another episode, and we reach Corte di San Giovanni di Malta. Here we find the church and the monastery of San Giovanni di Malta. The original church of San Giovanni del Tempio of the Temple was built in the 11th century by the Knights Templar of St. John. The foundation included a monastery and a hospice dedicated to St. Catherine, built to house pilgrims to the Holy Land. After the dissolution of the Knights Templar in 1312, the church passed to the Knights of St. John of Rhodes, later known as the Knights of Malta. The present church dates from a total rebuilding completed in 1565. We then walk along Calle di Furlani, where we can admire a lot of homes built using the famous barbacani. These are projecting wooden beams that made it possible to increase the floor space without obstructing already the narrow streets of the town. And we're finding ourselves in Campo delle Gatte, which sounds like cats, but this is the Venetian for legate or apostolic nuncio. This is a rather convivial neighborhood where you can find a lot of little tiny wine bars and local restaurants. We are on the way to Campo Santa Ternita, and we are also very far away from the crowds of Venice. This is a neighborhood that is really Venetian, and the bell tower of the Church of San Francesco della Vigna, it's visible from a lot of the little squares surrounding the area. It's also fun to stop at every little alley and have a look to the little courtyards. One of them is dedicated to the family Baffo, a very old family, and one of the most famous characters that belonged to the family was Giorgio Baffo, that in the 1700s wrote interesting erotic poems, and he was also the lover of Casanova's mother. And now we arrive in Campo Santa Ternita. The name derives from the church that was founded during the reign of Doge Pietro Cintranico. This was in the year 1000 and then demolished in 1832. The only thing that survived was the bell tower, worked for a while as a home for poor people, and then suddenly collapsed. And this was in 1880. In the center of the campo then is visible a beautiful well that has bas-reliefs with the images of St. Francis and St. John the Baptist. On the left side of the campo, a private bridge that leads to a palazzetto of the late 16th century. Crossing the bridge of Ponte del Suffragio, we are finding ourselves in Campo della Celestia. The name is from the former church of Santa Maria Celeste, known as the Celestia, which, with its convent, occupied the entire right side of the square. The church was erected in the late 11th century, and the convent was founded in 1237, the nuns coming from the town of Piacenza, not far from Milan. The church and convent were both suppressed by the French in 1810, and the church was then demolished in the 19th century, while the convent was converted to secular use. For a while, the convent housed part of the historic archives of Venice and also the university's faculty of chemical engineering. Today's itinerary stops by this arch, which seems to stand in the middle of nowhere, where, as Corto Sconto says, this is one of the famous Venetian doors that is capable to transfer you into new worlds of imagination. Hope you enjoyed the itinerary, and if you did, please subscribe, hit the bell, share it, and also consider to become a Patreon.